So today our question for you, Shamim, is as a queer and Muslim activist, we know that when we talk about women, the big role that people who identify as LGBTQA++ is made invisible. When motivating for the increased participation of women and young women in politics and decision-making, why is it important to always name and include LGBTIQA++ people as important leaders and decision makers?
Okay, my name is Shamim, as it was mentioned, and I'm an African citizen, African with a K, as my friend says, and currently living in Kenya, Mombasa. And from my side, I'd like just to start for us to picture out a scenario where you're a citizen and part of your civic duty includes voting for your leaders. You wake up, dress up, and go to the polling station. When you get there, you get to experience so much violence and discrimination, so that at a point you change your mind about participating in the exercise. This sounds very ridiculous, but it was actually a real scenario for many masculine presenting persons, especially masculine presenting lesbians in Uganda during their election period last year. Is it last year or this year? I think I've been overtaken by events. So this is an article a friend of mine wrote. It's called Too Masculine to Vote, LBQ Women in Uganda Speak About 2021 Elections by my friend called Billy Honey. This article really tries to, speak about the experiences of many LGBTI people when they are seeking the opportunity to practice their political or to exercise their political rights. A lot of times as LGBT people, when it comes to exercising our political rights, it is a choice between you want to do that, to be a citizen and exercise your rights, which many of our ancestors, many of our past leaders have fought for, especially women and queer women particularly have fought for, or do you want to be safe, right? So most of the time it's you have to juggle between those two. We've seen a lot of increased cases of rape, gender-based violence, physical assault against LGBTI people during election periods. And this is particularly even when you look at the post-election violence in Kenya in 2007, 2008 elections, as well as the 2013 elections. So a lot of LGBTIQ people faced a lot of violence. And this is just a reflection of what democracy, or rather the democracy freedom means to many of us. And not just for LGBT people, because I'm also a disabled person and I have to speak to that, is a lot of times we are shadowed by what democracy means. It's like you have to, you're fighting for your freedom to be, and being in a context where, very restrictive context where first you're not seen as an African, and secondly, your humanity is being debated every single day. And so you coming up and even just trying to fight for your right to exercise, your democracy, the right to vote for the leaders that you want, it's very difficult, right? A lot of the time we have the LGBT agenda being used as a political agenda, for example, in Kenya right now, we're heading to elections next year, and it is a narrative that is very popular amongst politicians. So that if you're pro-LGBT, supporting LGBT people, then you are anti-Kenya, you are anti-development for the country because you're embracing foreign concepts. And this is very important because it also goes an extra mile to show when decisions are being made, there's a lot of political influence as well. And if we don't have voices of LGBT persons or voices of allies for speaking with LGBTI people, then our interest obviously will not be there. I think this was particularly seen during the decision on the case of Appeal 162, where a lot of course, it was a legal judgment, but it seemed very much like a political judgment, a political ruling. And I think it speaks so much to how much influence do LGBT people have within the political spaces. And as I said earlier, there's a lot of barriers that sort of comes in when LGBTI people want to exercise our political rights. These barriers are from social aspects, where people would see an LGBTI person and how dare you, try to seek leadership, or how dare you participate in 1, 2, 3 things about our country. The other thing is, when you look at economically, of course, Kenya, it's like politics is also an economic issue where you have to have economic mileage for you to like to successfully participate like in politics. And of course, LGBTI people being at the tail end of all this, like you end up being, like left out. And there's also a very important need for us to look at, like even for LGBTI people who are in politics at the moment, it's very hard. They have to, like play respectability politics. They have to shrink themselves in order for them, like, to be acceptable within the spaces of politics. For example, if it's parliament, if it's people in the executive, you can't just say and stand and say, listen, I am a transgender woman and I am an MP in Kenya. Of course, that will cost you your, like your position. It will cost you a lot of your supporters. And so people all often have to choose between what passes and what does not pass. Of course, we've seen like a lot of heightened inequalities threatening our freedom for democracy. We have seen during COVID now, we've seen like the government putting in a lot of measures, which they seem like they're responses to COVID-19, but in essence, they are, like trying to shrink, or rather to curtail our access to, like democratic freedom. And we see, like, for example, in Kenya, we have the Building Bridges initiative. This is, of course, a very political process, a very political initiative. And when we have measures that have been put in place to curtail people's movements, people's access to this, like in conversations and contributing towards such initiatives, it's obviously like, puts people out. We also have moments in Kenya where LGBTI people would, of course, like would speak out and, like contribute to different political spaces, especially at the county level. And the interesting thing is that maybe at county level, of course, our efforts are being recognized, but when it comes to national level, there's a very big disconnect. And most of the time is we have allies, for example, in parliament, who are allies, yes, but they cannot outrightly speak on supporting the community because of, like, they will, as I said earlier, they lose their political mileage, they will lose their support. Apart from representation, or what Vivian said, there's need for liberation for many queer and trans people to feel empowered enough to run for political seats, for them to feel empowered enough to be open and to be out, of course, to be visible as who they are and still access, like some of these political seats, to be able to, like to be able to interview for the position of Chief Justice as open as who they are and who they identify as. I think like the other thing I would look at is how much, like efforts we've, like particularly the feminist movement has made, the women rights movement, the disability rights movement has made towards, like ensuring, particularly in Kenya, ensuring that these communities, these marginalized communities have some sort of space within the political class, the political space. And I'm saying sort of because like the quality of representation, the quality of participation of these communities in political processes is not that good. So I feel like there's need to learn from these movements, particularly I would say like the disability justice movement in Kenya. Of course, it's like very effed up, but there's need to learn like from each other. I feel like there's also there's a need to how to start speaking about affirmative action processes for LGBT people, because in this country, like we have a lot of violence, we have a lot of discrimination, state-sponsored homophobia, state-sponsored transphobia, and it's not spoken enough, and the impact it has on LGBT people, particularly when it comes to expressing and exercising their political rights.